Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks so much for joining us today. We're so excited to kick off this New Orleans Book Festival at Tulane University. It's a long time in coming, but we're finally here, and we're so happy to be here. I'm here with our co-chair, Walter Isaacson. And a few years ago, Walter and I put our heads together and decided that we wanted to have a big, grand book festival in New Orleans. And we had some stops and starts with the pandemic, but as you can see today, everything's going very well, and we're going to have a great turnout this weekend. So I hope you'll all come back. But today, we have a very special two guests that we'd like to introduce. Annette and Peter are both here today, and they're going to be talking about their book, Most Blessed of Patriarchs, Thomas Jefferson and the Empire of Imagination. So we're so happy to have them. Please give them a round of applause. And just to let you know, we're going to talk for about 30 minutes or so and save the last 10 minutes for question and answers. So get your questions. Know that you can buy books in the LBC, and we'll have a book signing, but I'll give you those details when we conclude. And thanks again for being here.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. I'm very glad that this has finally come off. At last, we are here again. It's good to see old friends and to be back at Tulane, where I have been one time before, I believe, and it's good to see everybody come out for this. Most Blessed of the Patriarchs, Thomas Jefferson and the Empire of the Imagination. We wrote this a few years back. A lot has taken place since then. We've had monument controversies, all kinds of things that have come to the fore that impact what we write about. And so we should start off by asking the question, who was Thomas Jefferson, and how do we fit him in today?
That's a great question, and when we wrote the book, we thought this was the Jefferson forever, that it couldn't possibly be dated. That's why we can be at this book festival and still touting the book that you have to buy several copies of. But things have changed, and historians are trained to be exquisitely conscious of change over time, only we like to put it back then rather than up here. Lots of things are changing, and so Thomas Jefferson is changing. Now, you might then think that we're sleazy relativists to say that because we like to have our founders stable so that we can revere them. Well, I'll forgive the language. We're not in the reverence business. We do think we are saying important things about Jefferson, but there's one redeeming character that historians have is we are, believe it or not, modest. And we know that our Jefferson is not for the ages. So consider this, the absolutely necessary epilogue to the book, which you get for free. We can't autograph it. I should give up on this, right? Let me say about Jefferson right now is that he's always been a controversial character. That's a given. He's always complicated, as Henry Adams suggested, how many thousand strokes go into the portrait of Thomas Jefferson. Yet there are different patterns now. We, of course, were writing all those years ago, 5 years ago, which is a split second in historical time, when Jefferson was certainly now situated at home with enslaved people. That was part of the collective consciousness about Jefferson, that you no longer could think of him and not think of Sally Hemings, not think of the many enslaved people that he owned over the course of his lifetime. Well, we thought we processed that and offered an understanding of Jefferson that would be useful. But that was before the recent movement centered on Black Lives Matter, that engagement, which has now become part of our general churn, the way we think about things. How do we situate our national history or resituate that national history to accommodate an emerging understanding of race? And believe me, this is not the end of the story. Race, as they say, is a social construction. It's constantly changing. It's changing before our eyes. So what I'd say is that this is a moment of confusion about Jefferson, but it's also a moment of interpretative opportunity when we can think about Jefferson in fresh ways. And we hope to suggest some of the ways. Am I too loud? Not loud enough? Really? Not loud enough. Nobody ever said that to me before. Okay. So it's, as I say, a moment in which we can sketch out some of the ways that we think we might be thinking about Jefferson. And I think the best way to begin in exploring that is to return to that notion of Jefferson at home, Jefferson at Monticello. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce my co-author, Annette Gordon-Reed, who is the expert on this subject. And what Annette has shown in her fabulous work is that you begin to understand a person like Thomas Jefferson differently when you do situate him, not just in a slave society, that's a familiar notion for historians, that is an economy and a society that's dominated by the institution of slavery, as provincial Virginia's was. But to think about him in the micro context of his home with real enslaved people, not with the problem of slavery. So how do you think over the last few years, that was the way you were moving, and that's your whole career is about that. What is it about that social historical perspective, that close look at the Hemingses of Monticello, and therefore at Thomas Jefferson, that gives us a different Jefferson?
Well, you see him with people, and you understand how his life at Monticello influenced his politics, influenced what he thought was going to happen in the country he helped to found. He's dealing with big issues. We were talking about this the other day, about in comparison to Washington, who doesn't muse about this question of race or muse about the future of America in as great a detail as Jefferson does. So when we're thinking about slavery, if you're thinking about race, it's not just those topics. It's about politics. It's about the nature of a Republican society. How do you fit people who are not like you into that polity? Are they a part of the polity? How are we going to do this? And so Jefferson dealing with individual people that we know, and we know about them because he was an inveterate record keeper, we could flesh all of this out and put him in the context of a person at Monticello, the person who's in Philadelphia, drafting the American Declaration of Independence, member of the Continental Congress, and then all of the various roles that he played. He talks very much about how important Monticello was to him. So we have to think of what Monticello actually is. It's not, have people been to Monticello? Wow, this is a good number of people in this audience. I suppose it's self-selecting to some degree. Monticello was very, very important to him. And his understanding of the world that he wanted to come into being sort of emanates from that place, from what he learned in that particular place. So it's important to think about that in as much a detail as possible. And that's something that I don't think, I'm sure didn't really figure very much in earlier biographies of him. Slavery was seen as a problem, but you don't have individual people interacting with him, understanding how it shaped his life, and then shaped his understanding of the kind of leader he wanted to be and what he wanted for the country.
The private Jefferson up close and personal, as they said in the 1984 Winter Olympics, the private Jefferson was portrayed as somebody we could love and like because he was set within his white family. And people who take pilgrimages to Monticello would go there to get an aura, a feeling of that sentimentalized, sanitized private life. In effect, to look at the private Jefferson was to be an apologist. He was a man of his times. Don't condemn him, because just imagine yourself here if you're a visitor to Monticello. Imagine yourself, you could grow up to be president. Maybe you could be the next Thomas Jefferson. This is your world. But your approach is significantly broader than that. And the interesting thing, I think, is it exposes and helps us understand some things about his public life as well. That is, if we overcome those artificial distinctions between the private and the public, I'm like this equally loud throughout my entire life lecturing people. No, I'm just joking. But if you can tell something about someone, you know what they're like, you have that intimate knowledge. And I think that's what we're trying to capture now, is where is that going? What have we begun to discover about Jefferson? Particularly, I think the great challenge with Jefferson is to get over despising him because he's a racist. Racism is despicable, but that tells us nothing. What tells us something in this historical moment is to explore what intimacy between the races within the institution of slavery, with all the injustices built in, baked in, that can begin to get us, I think, to a better place. And what we'd like to do in our conversation is suggest some of the places we might be going with Jefferson in the future. So you young scholars who are going to follow in our big footsteps will know what the next book has to be.
Well, I mean, it's important to do that. And when we set out to write the book, the thinking was to try to take Jefferson on his own terms. We'd noticed that there had been a lot of Jefferson and books, Jefferson and slavery, Jefferson and religion, and all of these other things that people are interested in. And he'd been sort of separated out in a way. And the idea of the book is to bring him back together, all of those kinds of things, the statesman, the architect, the slave owner, the revolutionary, the person who did all of these things, into one person, and to try to take him seriously as much as you possibly could. You can take him at face value with things, and we thought that has been missing. A lot of scholarship approaches it as, well, we know who the real person is, and we're not going to let you get away with this. And it's okay, and it's necessary sometimes to be skeptical, but you can carry that so far that you miss what the person actually believes, what that person actually thinks. And we wanted to try to bring that together in a lot of different aspects of his life. We picked some things that were important to him. We talk about music, we talk about politics, we talk about Virginia, of course. Music is the one that people get sort of puzzled over, but he said it was the favorite passion of his soul, music was. So when somebody describes it that way, and people talk about him singing all the time, and he sang for people, and he played the violin, that was a core part of his existence. And we talk about what that says about the kind of person he was, and to bring that to the fore, not just the politics of it. And I understand it's a very tough thing. I'm on the board of the New York Historical Society, and we very recently had a controversy in New York City about a statue of Jefferson that was in the city council, and they wanted it moved because people did not like to have the statue looming over them as they're doing their work of this person who is a slave owner and all of those things. And what ended up happening is that they were moving the statue to the New York Historical Society. And we're going to do a sword exhibit, and I will write something to try to explain why he's there and why I still think that it's important for him to be there.
Meanwhile, Teddy Roosevelt is going out to the Black Hills?
No, Teddy Roosevelt is gone. I think he may be going out to for people who don't know, there's a statue in front of there was a statue in front of the American Museum of Natural History with TR on a horse and a black man and a native person, an indigenous man, walking beside him, sort of holding on to him like he's sort of leading them into the future. That's the statue of TR by himself would be perfectly fine by me, but the message that one was sending was a bit much. So he's gone. But the Jefferson, no, he's going some other place, but the Jefferson statue will be in the New York Historical Society contextualized, and I will hope to try to do that in a way that makes, as I said, people understand why he should be there, and why, instead of someone that we should reject, that's someone we have to grapple with, because as Peter and I say in the book, and I think we demonstrate, this is a person who was pivotal to the formation of the country and has so many different aspects of his life are related to this and are important to what we're doing now, that you can't dismiss him. You have to grapple with him, and that's a better way to go.
Well, let's pick up on that music theme for just a minute and work out some of the implications. Jefferson's the famous, or used to be the famous iconic Democrat and the hero of the Big D democracy, then with various additional team members like Franklin Roosevelt. He's been downgraded and removed from places like New York City Council. But for Jefferson, music reveals something about his passions, as Annette puts it, but also about the way he wants to orchestrate conversation. In fact, think of making music as a highly formalized, stylized, predictable, pre-scripted way of conversing. People know their parts, and they know the importance of collaboration. For Jefferson, the notion of achieving a kind of peaceful and harmonious collaboration in real life as well as in private life, that theme, as we interpret Jefferson's engagement with music, it tells us something about how important it is for him to nourish civic life, to, of course, education is a big theme for him, that people, and learning how to play music, and as Annette is now recovering a lost youth when she could have been a concert pianist. Yeah, well, it happens. See, the personal is really important. That idea of bringing people together in non-threatening ways, in ways that they can clearly see the added benefit of being together. Think of that as a microcosm of the perfect republic. Isn't a perfect republic a beautiful idea when we're all equal and we don't split off into various factions, jazz, hip-hop, Baroque, you name it, and compete for airspace in a zero-sum game? But that somehow the things that really matter, the things that really matter to Jefferson, what he called the Republican creed laid out in the Declaration of Independence, think of that as sheet music for a nation. If we all believe in the importance of that structured harmony, this is not diminishing you, any individual self, but it's demonstrating to you the absolutely essential interdependence of Republican government. This is not a libertarian vision. He's been falsely interpreted as a person who's obsessed with individual rights. And that works for a lot of people, but it's deeply misleading because the whole point of the individual, and Jefferson's focused on constructing a kind of Republican self, the kind of person who could flourish in a republic and make a republic flourish. The things that are in fact most inspiring about Jefferson are least descriptive and prescriptive of American history. It didn't happen that way, but it's against that backdrop of those conceptions of what the new nation might be, what could be achieved in that republic, that we can, I think, get a better sense of how to think about Jefferson. Just for a moment, imagine that idea of making beautiful music together. It doesn't sound like beautiful music right now, and I'm not saying that Jefferson's got the solution for us, but what we do need is to understand him better, and that will give us a point of departure, not in celebrating Jefferson and finding a way to restore him to his place in the national pantheon, but to look at Jefferson and his generation as real founders, and not just the people we call founders, but everybody. In fact, I think that's the big theme about the Declaration, which might be something we could talk about in the context of we know our man, or we think we do, and we should be modest. Nobody will ever know anybody, as you well know about your neighbor and family members. But we can get close. We can get some kind of workable idea. Jefferson, the owner of slaves, the person who is everything his critics have described, who sometimes loses it in abstraction, that Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence. What does it mean that Jefferson wrote the Declaration of Independence? Stop for a minute, because many of you would say, well, he's a hypocrite, isn't he? Because he says all men are created equal. But there's a lot more to the Declaration. And just this morning, we drilled each other on trying to memorize a letter that Abraham Lincoln wrote to this guy, Pierce. 1859. Beautiful letter, which I would paraphrase, but Annette, with her steel trap mind and photographic memory and iPhone.
An iPhone, we'll say.
She's just outsourced.
Outsourced
It's
all
so
of this
vulgar
stuff.
to have it interior, and,
Yes.
and it's just she's generously sharing it.
No,
with
it's a wonderful, I think it's a wonderful quote. All honor to Jefferson, to the man who, in the concrete pressure of a struggle for national independence by a single people, had the coolness, forecast, and capacity to introduce into a merely revolutionary document an abstract truth, applicable to all men and all times, and so embalm it there that today and in all coming days it shall be a rebuke and a stumbling block to the very harbingers of reappearing tyranny and oppression. I think it's a great quote because it talks about, it says, the Declaration is about breaking from Great Britain, explaining to the world why they're doing that, justifying it in a very lawyerly way, I might say, as to why that this is necessary. But he starts out with the preamble, we hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. Why is that there? It doesn't have to be there. They could have just said, we're leaving, and he could have just explained. But to take this moment to make that kind of universal statement, which, as I said, isn't necessary for the expression of the grievances that they're explaining, that justifying this, but what we've taken as America's creed. And every single group that's tried to make a place for itself in America points to that. And he's doing this, as Lincoln says, in the middle of this struggle where people are killing each other and fighting in a very, very, us against them moment to say that there's this universal truth that we have to recognize, and that has given us a creed that we've been fighting about. Now, you talk about hypocrisy, and people say, well, did he really mean it? And, he had slaves and so forth. But people can express, and have many times expressed truths, even if they don't live up to those things themselves. We take that, and we've, as I said, made something of it ourselves as Americans, and we can continue that. Now, the question is, and people would say, well, do we need Jefferson? Can we have these words without thinking about him? And I think for narrative purposes, for telling the story of a country, you need people. You need to have people. The ideas are important and they're critical, but you have to understand the person. I think it's good to understand the person who wrote this, the times he was in, the things that he dealt with, and the understanding of why he was not. He didn't believe in the end that black people and white people could live together in harmony because of this idea of that slavery had robbed African American people of amor patri. How could you love a country where you have been treated like this? And he said whites would not give up their prejudices. That's the non-optimistic Jefferson. That's the realistic Jefferson. And then the truth is, it hasn't been easy. We've been struggling. We're still struggling with this now. And to say that he was too pessimistic really doesn't get. I think we're not being realistic about ourselves if we think that he could have thought of this as an easy thing.
And maybe we could spend a little time with Lincoln on this question, because it is a very rich letter. He says all honor, and that's significant, and he's pointing to the concrete circumstances of nation making. And Abraham Lincoln is an interesting character because you might call him he's a latter-day Whig. He's a Republican. Remember the old Republican Party? He was a Republican as president, but the Republican Party was a new party, an insurgent party. He grew up as a Whig. And when it comes to race and slavery, Whigs may have been the woke, Northern Whigs, the woke people of their time. And good Whigs in the Henry Clay School would be appalled at Jefferson, would be pointing the finger at Jefferson. And young Lincoln would be one of them. He'd say, Lincoln he associates Lincoln with states' rights, with the Missouri crisis, with the democracy, just as the democracy under Jackson embraced Jefferson. And that was leading straight to Civil War and the collapse of the Union. But Lincoln saw past that. And it's that ability to hold two things in his mind at once and honor them because they're both important. When he says, those abstractions, all men are created equal, that's a wonderful, that's a pearl of wisdom, is something we need to cherish. Yet we also need to cherish the nation, and there'd be no nation without that concrete moment of fighting for our liberties. I'm now getting patriotic and identifying with these guys. But that's what Lincoln did, the hard thing in a hard moment when the future of his union, a union he cherished, was at risk, was to say, the patron saint of the bad guys actually gave us words to live by, and the people we now demonize as our enemies were our allies, our fellow Americans in making the nation. I think it's that complicated thing. That's not hypocrisy. That's not to reduce Jefferson's career to his failure to live up to the principles of the Declaration of Independence. Well, guess what? Jefferson knew he failed. He didn't feel all that bad about it. He took his failures in stride because he thought this is the work of our generation to make the nation. But it was on the agenda, not his agenda. We wish it were. We said, oh, Jefferson, you could have been a really great man if you had done something to end the institution of slavery, but how could you end the institution of slavery and preserve the Union in 1776? How could you do it? In fact, in many ways, breaking with Britain made it harder to get rid of slavery. This is the tragedy of unintended consequences. We live in a sea of unintended consequences. Such pervasive unintentional consequences that we take it as nature, as given, that nothing can be done. But here is Lincoln saying there is something to hold on to. There is, and I think this is a context within which we can rethink Jefferson, the context of a national history. Enough of being ashamed of it. Of course, we've just been doing some comparative history in a class that we teach at the law school about other countries. Guess what? They got shitty histories. Is that acceptable in your life? I just thought I'd break that transgress a little bit. But that's actually a very mild term. I mean, history involves and necessarily entails incredible tragedies, and we're always living in the midst of them, often in denial. Let's get their tragedies right in retrospect to learn from them as we, in the fog of the moment that we live in now, don't begin to understand that the tragedies that are unfolding in our own moment.
Well, that's the fun thing about writing about history, and the exasperating thing, and illuminating thing, to think about that time and to think about our own time when people will, and wonder what people will look back on and what we're doing and say, they thought that mattered. They thought that this thing that they were doing was going to solve the problem, and that little thing, when in fact, we believe in it. We're sincere, and we're thinking, we think we're moving forward, and that may not be the case, and it wasn't the case with him.
So what are some of the things that we can take away from Jefferson? Maybe it's a nice time to pivot towards this question I've been asking Annette for the last, tell me how many years.
I don't want to say how many years.
She's still young, but it's been a long time. Just among us, I've always accused Annette of liking Jefferson too much. I mean, I do come from New England, and I consider myself a neo-late left Federalist or something like that.
If you could figure that out.
Yeah. When I figure out, I'll report back.
Yeah.
But anyway, that you like him too much, and read about him when she was a girl, and then wrote books which are in their own way. They're devastating about Jefferson, but they're also generous. I think that's Annette's real gift.
Well, I think I would be generous with any subject. I mean, writing about people, writing about a person, you have to take, as we said, the person. What do they think they're doing? How do they think that they're operating in this world? And I think it's better to do that if you really want to find out what happened, if you really want to find out who this individual was. And this has been a journey to try to bring that all out. Are we ready to take questions, I think?
Oh, she's had enough of this, huh? Oh, I thought
Just
we
a
had
good
1 minute and
place.
16 seconds.
No.
I wanted to be sure we
no,
had a few
a
minutes
minute
in
and
case
60
anybody had any questions. So
Okay.
I don't know if anybody wants to use the microphone, they're welcome to do that. There was a great discussion, and while anybody's getting up to do it, I'll just let you know how happy we are to have Annette Gordon-Reed and Peter Onuf here. And we have
There's the mic right there.
Mr. Charlie Goodyear will have the first question.
Yes, hi. I was wondering if you two saw any connective tissue at all between the political tradition of Jeffersonianism and the MAGA movement.
And the MAGAs.
Yep.
The maggots, did you say?
That goes. No, don't say that. Is the microphone on?
No, we're just hard of hearing because we're getting on.
Yes, that's true. That's on.
Okay. Did you
Yeah, there it
guys,
is.
did
Now
you
it's
guys
on.
hear me the first
MAGAs.
time?
Now it's on.
Okay. Do
Yeah,
you
I-
see any connective tissue between the political tradition of Jeffersonianism and the Make America Great Again movement?
Well, I would suppose the idea of revolution, if that's part of it, the right to revolution,
Yeah, there is. I mentioned the libertarian strain. You can do that with Jefferson. In fact, that's the wonderful thing about all those strokes that Henry Adams talked about. Each one of them can be aligned to Jefferson, to you, that you can identify him with. But no, not really. Really, if you want Jefferson, I think the core Jefferson, there are retrograde. He's very conservative in some ways. You could say that he really is as close as you get to an aristocrat in 18th century Anglo-America. All that said, where Jefferson lived, where he dreamed, where he imagined was in the future. He had a conception of change over time. It's the flip of what we study as change over time. He imagined change over time. And his imagining does not map on to what we've lived, and that's obvious, should be obvious, but it does have a core message, I think, and it's addressed, you seem, from my perspective, to be awfully young. Now, don't take that as an insult, because we nearly terminal, liminal old people love young people, because you're the future. And Jefferson in retirement, he was able to say, I'm no longer among the living, otherwise known as the Madison administration, thank God. But the idea that a people, if it would be a people over time, remember Lincoln honored him for imagining the future, because that's an aspirational idea. Think of the things in the American Creed as aspirational. Consent is the foundation of legitimate authority, the equality of all persons, citizens, all of those are wonderful things. But they don't just happen because some smart people in 1776 said, yeah, we got it nailed. It happens because every generation needs to relive and reenact and reperform that founding revolutionary moment. In the best of all Jeffersonian worlds, they would rewrite the Constitution every 19.1 years, and we'll tell you more about that if you really want to know. But that idea that the earth belongs to the living, I think that's a beautiful idea. And I would say I didn't get a chance to share my feelings about Jefferson and how they've changed because I got cut off so abruptly. But
I did that.
yeah. I like Jefferson more as I get older. I used to pretty much not like him back when we first met, and I had to talk about him because I got the Jefferson job at Virginia. But I've mellowed out on him. He could not do the things that would make those aspirations be fulfilled. Mm-hmm. It was beyond him, and we know why. It's not mysterious. Mm-hmm. But I honor, as Lincoln honors, the idea of faith in the future, a faith that for Jefferson in his own time was stretched to the limit because his fellow Virginians were not enlightened. In a way, for Jefferson to be an effective politician, for Jefferson to to work effectively in his world, he had to embrace the prejudices of his fellow countrymen, because remember, everybody's got to vote. You have to believe there is in our fellow Americans the capacity at some time in the future to do the right thing. And you give up on that faith, you give up on democracy.
Well, I mean, and the map, I would say, when I mentioned the right to revolution, I mean, there are double sides to this. I mean, the earth belongs to the living, and the idea that you're supposed to redo things and renew this spirit means that people can renew things in ways that you don't want, that you may not want. And so in that sense, there's a there's a positive side. Well, it's risk, and that's the part of it. I mean, that's the risky thing about the idea of a democracy and republicanism, is that the people can decide to go some way that other people don't want to go. And I'm sure people can go through and find quotes from Jefferson that fit, that do map onto that. But I think Peter's point about community, what he was saying earlier, that this was not all just about individuals and what individuals wanted, that this has to be done within the confines of an understanding about a community that is supposed to be moving forward in a Republican society.
Thanks so much.
How you doing? I'll take a couple of minutes. I teach here in the business school, so I'm very interested always in the economic impacts of the progression in politics and how sometimes we take 2 steps back to go 3 steps forward. Speaking, first of all, I think I'll buy your book, not just get it out of the library. Very interesting talk. Yeah, that's right. You don't have to sign it. But the idea is this. I've always looked at Jefferson as, so I'm sort of like you. I'm a Southerner, but I'm sort of a Federalist, not an anti-Federalist. And I look at Jefferson as somebody who had a great imagination and clearly had some great philosophical sort of impulses. But the reason we're here today in Louisiana, in New Orleans, is because of Jefferson. Not solely him, but solely not based on that, but Jefferson bought Louisiana in the purchase from France, and that's why we're here. His idea, as I understand it, was to have a republic of yeoman farmers. And that's what we're going to do with this country. And that would kill slavery, because there's no way you could compete with free labor versus the small family farm. So if you could speak to that a little bit, and then maybe his impact on the national economy at its time now, and maybe any long-lasting sort of impact that you see with it. Yeah. Thank you.
Well, I could start that. I'll try to be short-winded, which is just uncharacteristic. That fantasy of the yeoman farmer, I describe or impute to what I call Pennsylvania envy, because that's the world of eastern Pennsylvania in Jefferson's lifetime of small family farms. It still worked. Commercial agriculture could be run, producing market surpluses. And with the increasing emphasis on wheat production in the Chesapeake area, wheat lends itself to smaller scale operations, and you can imagine family farms working it. Mm-hmm. I think there's a danger in taking too literally the yeoman farmer, because that farmer, that's not a description of actual people Jefferson knew. It's not a description of Thomas Jefferson, who, of course, runs a large-scale staple production operation, increasingly inefficiently. The implications for the country are, it would take a long-winded exposition, and for the economy. Probably the most important result for the economy is to encourage what legal historian Willard Hurst called a release of energy, to promote resource stripping, settlement, and expansion of commercial agriculture into the hinterland. That provides the framework within which takeoff takes place in the U.S. Because however much you might idolize, in theory, the notion of truly independent farmer, show me an independent farmer and I'll put him on a statue and we could worship him. They don't exist. Farmers know that they're not only creatures of the seasons, but they're creatures of the markets. And how markets are made and how you get access to them, these are profoundly political questions. the important thing about the expansion of agriculture is it generates a need for investment in infrastructure, internal improvements, roads, canals, railroads. Creating an expansive single market was the great contribution of the American Revolution. And contemporaries saw it that way too, that is knocking down potential tariff barriers and enabling Anglo-Americans to trade freely with each other across an expanding union. That was a big deal. That was the model for German nationalists, Friedrich List and other advocates of so-called national economy, was to break down tariff barriers within Europe or among the German states. Americans tend to overlook the degree to which this was a nation-making project. Jefferson's emphasis on broad political participation is part of a larger strategy to generate growth through expanding commerce. This doesn't sound like your textbook Jefferson, but this is the fact. And perhaps the last thing I would say, and I know I'm medium-winded right now, is Hamilton, of course, and all our Federalist friends are crucially important in creating the structures that enable the U.S. to handle public debt and expand credit. They get it. Jefferson doesn't begin to understand it. What Jefferson does understand is the need for promoting legitimacy, for making the regime seem legitimate. And that's important politically and economically. And as you know, in this period, political economy, that's a single concept. And if you get people with a sense that they're part owners of America, that they're participating in their own governance, that's the great challenge today. It's easy to imagine it. It's as if the farm in an early modern agricultural society provides conditions in which we can really imagine democracy functioning because of broad equality and distribution of rights and so forth. Okay, I'll stop. But you get the big picture? Is that?
Yeah. Well, but I would say that as for Hamilton, right now he's sort of enjoying a renaissance because he's the inventor of modern America.
Of rap, right?
The inventor of rap. No, the inventor of modern America. It's really the energy that Peter's talking about that was unleashed, of these people moving forward. It was not the mercantilist dream that Hamilton had. I mean, he talked in terms of finance and all of those things, but you can't draw a straight line, I think, from that to where we are today.
There are no straight lines.
No straight lines.
My question is to Dr. Reed. It's a pleasure. Thank you both for coming. My name is Paula Manns. I taught economics for like 32 years, but my question is not about economics. I'm really excited about what's happening in history now. I think history is being turned on its head because now we have all these new voices. And what I'm reading about is stuff that I didn't know existed, that was really going on at the time. So my question to Dr. Reed is this. I'll start out with the imperfect founding father. Who was behind him, his influences in the time of Jefferson, looking at him in his day-to-day life? What female influences have you found of women, and Black women in particular, in his role as a family man, a founder, a musician, a writer, a politician, an international negotiator? When I taught economics, I would always tease my students, well, where's the founding mothers? Because I know they were there. So can you speak to, if you know of, how did women influence this important founding father that we have today?
Well, certainly his wife, his daughter, Martha, who was probably Jefferson Randolph is the most important person in his life, influencing his understanding about family life. I don't know about politics as much. There's a thinking that he doesn't really deal with women in politics, but he talks to his daughter about politics quite a bit. And so, Sally Hemings, the person that he lived with, a woman that he lived with, had kids with, it's hard to say how she would have influenced him. I think his situation with her family influenced his understandings about race. And it was something that he grappled with, trying to figure out, again, where African American people, how they fit in society. But it's tough because he doesn't talk about that. He doesn't write about that. And so it would just be pure speculation.
Well, the one thing I would add, and this is hard to answer, and Annette is exactly right, but of course there are women all over the place. And now I can't see very many men out there anymore, just joking. But it's the capacity in a sentimental age, and sentiment and feelings are very important to Thomas Jefferson. As our dear late friend Jan Lewis wrote in some brilliant essays in a recently published book, which we should be promoting at this festival, which is terrible, called, what's it called? Family? Name it. Family, slavery, and...
Race, family, and slavery in Jefferson.
Race, yeah, in the early American Republic. And Jan makes the important point, and she deduces this from the style of oratory of male politicians increasingly are reaching out to and imagining the feelings of women. One way to put it is, I think guys can cry now, and we could maybe rehearse it collectively because we're all sensitive. We think guys used to be tough and masculine and patriarchal, and we call our book, it's about a patriarch. But there was a new form of domesticated patriarchy, and domestic is a key word, in which there was an emphasis in the capacity to understand and empathize. And so many of the eloquent speakers of Jefferson's age, and Jefferson was not one of them, but would appeal to the feelings of their interlocutors, and men would cry. And if men can cry, then they understand what it's like to be a woman.
That was his understanding of it. But I mean, I would say, certainly, when I mentioned his wife, one of the raps on him, one of the criticisms of him as a young man was that he was too solicitous of her feelings, that when she was ill, he would, leave and try to be with her. So I think, and that was not considered a manly thing to do at the time, to take care of wife and children. So in that sense, he was kind of ahead of his time on that question. And the idea, there's a moment when his son-in-law is about to engage in a duel, and he is foursquare against this, and he writes this letter where he's really pleading with him, and he basically says, you're going to leave your wife and children unprotected in the world because of what someone said about you. And he thought that was ridiculous. And of course, that's back to Hamilton. I mean, that's out of that's separate from people's notion of honor, that you're willing to die, you're willing to, and so Jefferson is thinking at this moment, well, that's silly because there's something more important here, and that's your family. So I think women influenced him in the way that he conducted himself in his private life, his understanding about what honor meant, what duty meant, and the kinds of duties that men had to women, the women in their lives.
Thank you.
And I'm Professor Gordon Reed. I'm not a doctor. He's a doctor. I'm a doctor.
Yeah.
I'm a Juris Doctor. We don't call ourselves doctor. We're just lawyers.
Y'all have
we
time for
another
one more question?
If we keep the questions coming, we will never stop, and that's good, because I'm only here for a while. So ask away.
Hi, thank you so much. My name's Kayla. I am a first year here at Tulane, and I'm planning on majoring in international relations and history, concentration in American history, as it so happens. So I'm curious, you've done all this history research on Thomas Jefferson, but what do you predict will be the future of Thomas Jefferson in the United States?
Wow, that's a tough one. That's a tough one, because I mentioned the issue of the statues. And strangely enough, Peter referred to "The Earth Belongs to the Living," a letter he writes to James Madison, and he used that phrase, that idea, in other contexts, where he basically says, every generation of people has a right to chart its own course. Well, there's a good side and a bad side to that. It could be, for him, it could be that people say,
Enough.
We want, we have other people. But, for me, and I've used this analogy a couple of times, and I kind of got slammed for it, well, chided about it. This is not the Soviet Union, or this is not. You don't want to be in a society where people like that get totally disappeared. That you pretend that the person didn't do the things that he did or she did. He's not a Confederate in my mind. That's a different question. This is a person who is at the founding of the country, and so many things that are important to us that we can point to, the Library of Congress, West Point. I mean, he has a hand in everything. I would hope that the future would be that he would stay around and we would talk about it because he illustrates so many different veins in our own lives now, so many areas in our own life. And that's my hope, but I'm not sure. There was I think in San Francisco, apparently, there was some backlash against.
Oh, they've restored the names.
They restored the names,
Yeah.
I mean, they'd taken them out, and people were thinking that this is it's a bridge too far. So it's going to be contested.
Yeah, I agree. One way to think about it is, will the nation survive? And if the nation survives, what resources does it draw on? What stories does it tell about itself to sustain its survival? Of course, it nearly collapsed in the Civil War, and it could collapse again. And I think Jefferson would be the first to say, as he said in his own time, a republic is a kind of experiment. And that experiment is rerun, he would say, every generation. We know that generations are discontinuous. It's ridiculous to talk about 19-year intervals. But I think the main reason to remember Jefferson is a Jefferson restored to his contexts. That Jefferson as a statue, we don't need. We could think of other statues, or we could have a plurality of statues. We just don't need them. What we need is an understanding of Jefferson in his moment, in action, doing what he did in a much broader human context of his fellow Americans, in a world in which not all of the people who lived in the boundaries of what became the United States were patriots. A large number were loyalists, and many could care less, and many people were enslaved. It's a complicated world. But one thing that we can draw from Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence itself is collective action on behalf of ideas that seem worth fighting for. For most people, it's just the existence of some kind of imagined community. But that community, and that's what Lincoln is asking and honoring Jefferson for, that community could be looking towards something better. So I would say when we're not doing that, when we feel hopeless, when we don't think there's a future, when we will be complicit in the collapse of the nation, then Jefferson collapses. We don't think about him anymore. We don't need him. It's just another failed state with its own history. Antiquarians will be interested in it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, I think that's our time.